To say that Dark Souls has been the most influential video game of this decade might be an understatement. Like a giant crow, it swooped down to carry gamers away from a market flooded with titles that barely ever surpassed tutorial level difficulty and into a truly hardcore realm that challenged their skills and rewarded patience and perseverance. The massive success of Dark Souls and its sequels even spawned an entire subgenre that shows no signs of stopping anytime soon. The game is already a classic and it will undoubtedly be remembered as long as there are gamers around to remember it, but we aren't here just to talk about Dark Souls. Well, not just the 2011 Dark Souls at least. This video is here to show you the complete order of the Souls games and then some. So without any further ado, let's begin. First, we have to talk about the Souls series. Now, the Souls series of games comprises not only the 3 Dark Souls titles, but also Demon Souls. There are some who deem that Demon Souls should not get bundled together with Dark Souls, but given how much the gameplay mechanics and the approach to storytelling are, as well as the fact that all of these games were made by the same developer, we have no qualms about referring to them as a single franchise. Let's start from the beginning, shall we? Demon Souls is an often overlooked PS3 exclusive that laid the foundation for all Souls games to come. At the time, and this time was 2009, its key elements such as stamina bar management that actually influence how you approached combat, respawning enemies, and the possibility of losing your XP, or in this case souls, upon death was revolutionary. But another thing that helped truly distinguish Demon Souls from all the other games of that era was its approach to storytelling and its distinct atmosphere that permeated through the entire game. It's safe to say that it was truly a game ahead of its time. However, its experimental approach was also the game's biggest weakness. In retrospect, we know that the Souls formula works, but given that this was the first game using set formula, it's safe to say that it was unrefined. The combat here feels quite unpolished, the animation looks old, and even the gameplay feels wonky, with some classes and playstyles clearly coming out as objectively stronger and better. What's more, there were a couple of interesting bosses, but most of them were forgettable. So is Demon Soul the underrated visionary masterpiece that many consider it to be? Seeing as it set the groundwork for an entire subgenre of games, all of which are critically acclaimed, we definitely can't overstate its significance. However, it's not a game we would recommend to people outside the Souls niche, simply due to how clunky and unbalanced it is. When viewed independently from the legacy that it spawned, we mainly appreciate Demon Soul for its rich world, beautiful environments, and a truly haunting atmosphere. Fast forward about 2 years and we have the release of a game that needs no introduction, the holy grail of gaming that many still swear upon today, the original Dark Souls. This game is the spiritual successor to Demon Soul, and it not only inherited the Souls formula, but more importantly refined it to the point that it managed to redefine the modern action RPG genre and attain cult status only years after its release. Those of you who haven't played Dark Souls probably only know about the game's supposed difficulty. Now we say supposed not because the game isn't hard, but because it isn't unfair, at least 90% of the time. The thing about Dark Souls is that it doesn't hold the player's hand and serve to them everything on a platter so that the player will never feel inconvenienced. No, Dark Souls makes you earn that victory. If you want to win, you have to work for it, to get good if you will. But this only made it so that succeeding felt all the more satisfying. Difficulty alone is not enough to propel a game into cult status, but other aspects are often overlooked by those who haven't played the game. Dark Souls manages to tie the overall theme and plot of the game so neatly, yet so cryptically. The mythology of the world and the characters in it are very rarely conveyed to the player overtly, yet they permeate nearly every level of the game. It's up to the player whether they want to hunt for clues in item descriptions and decipher cryptic lines of dialogue, but if they choose to do so, all the pieces of the story will eventually fall into their place and tell the story of the dark and dilapidated land of Lordran. Sure, the game still has some issues, most notably the combat still feels clunky, but it's way easier to overlook this because of how magnificent and memorable most of the bosses are and how tight the game world was, with areas looping back to one another in ways that the players didn't expect but always appreciated. Now, what truly drives home the point of just how grand this game was the fact that it attained massive popularity despite the console versions of the game suffering from some heavy performance issues and the PC version being next to unplayable without mods, not to mention a PC controller. Faced with these issues, many games, even good games, would have crashed and burned, so the fact that Dark Souls still managed to dominate the gaming world despite these setbacks truly goes to show how monumental and exquisite this game really is. No one in their right mind would have jumped through so many hoops to play a game that's just difficult and nothing else. Now, we've ranted about the original Dark Souls a bit more than we intended to, but that's okay since there isn't as much to say about the second game. Dark Souls 2 is unequivocally seen as the weakest link in the franchise, and this was no doubt due to the fact that the team that had created the original Dark Souls was busy working on Bloodborne, so they had little or no hand in making this sequel. Dark Souls 2 is the type of sequel that was made just because the popular demand warranted a sequel. It basically went the Assassin's Creed route, more for the sake of more. It has a few standout locations, but these were very much the exception and not the rule. Everything just feels bland, from the story and level design to most of the bosses. Another disappointing thing are the graphics, which were scaled down so that the game could be released on last-gen consoles. But here's the thing, Dark Souls 2 is not a bad game. It's not, despite everything we've just said. It's just that it keeps company with such renowned titles that it seems bad by comparison. We genuinely think if this game didn't have the Dark Souls name, but instead was a Souls-like game, one developed by another studio perhaps, that it would have fared much better. If you're looking for more Souls games, this is it. And one thing that definitely goes in the game's favor is the fact that the game has a massive amount of content. It's not an exceptional game, which makes it appear bad next to all the other FromSoftware games that are all exceptional without a fault. But if you skipped Dark Souls 2 because of the general hate surrounding it and are craving more Dark Souls, you should definitely play this. Dark Souls 3 is third and final installment in the Souls series. It's important to keep in mind that this game was released after Bloodborne, which we'll talk about in a second, because it truly does seem to be an amalgamation of everything that was good about both Dark Souls and Bloodborne. The Bloodborne-inspired art direction definitely rubbed some fans the wrong way, but many were thankful for the more fluid combat that finally got rid of the clunkiness that the Souls game had been known for. Many of the bosses also contained a lot of Bloodborne in their DNA, making the boss fights that had up to that point been very slow and reactionary a lot more fast-paced. Now, Dark Souls 3 is a standalone game, but the team definitely wanted to tie the story more to the first game to appease all the fans who were disgruntled with the second installment. As such, the story is best enjoyed after you've played the first game. In fact, since the story is still presented in a cryptic manner, we'd argue that you won't understand any of it without having played the first game. Of course, this doesn't mean that you can't play the third game if that's what you want. Beating the game without paying any heed to any of the story beats has always been an option with the Soul games. So if that's what you want to do, go right ahead. The game won't be any easier and the fulfillment of beating it any less, but you won't be getting the full experience. As for the gameplay, it's still second only to the original Dark Souls. It's a lot less unforgiving than the first game, with many open environments that allow for carefree role spamming, but there's no doubt that it's overall a better game than both Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 2. Now, we've already mentioned the Souls-like genre, and while most of the games within this genre are excellent, in this video we'll only be talking about the ones made by FromSoftware. Some of the defining characteristics of this genre are the stamina bar, the penalty for dying, and the sheer difficulty. But while many other developers simply seek to emulate this formula, usually with a single gimmick that helps set their game apart, FromSoftware isn't as restricted when it comes to expanding on what Souls-like games can be. Unsurprisingly, their Souls-like games are the best Souls-like games, although we only have two titles to speak of at the moment: Bloodborne and Sekiro. Bloodborne may not be a Souls game in name, but many still consider it one. In fact, for the longest time, gamers used the term Soulsborne to refer to the entire body of work FromSoftware has developed since Demon's Soul. It'll be interesting to see whether this term will grow obsolete now that Sekiro is out, but only time will tell. After 3 games that closely followed the Souls formula, Bloodborne was the first title that saw the developers expand upon it in significant ways. For example, while there are many aspects of the game that were inherited from Dark Souls, Bloodborne takes a huge departure from it in that it ditches the safe play method of Dark Souls' block, roll, and poke gameplay in favor of a more aggressive playstyle. Instead of shields, players now have guns, and instead of punishing recklessness, the game now attaches high rewards to proportionally high risks. The fact that parrying is less risky and that you can regain health by attacking enemies immediately after after receiving damage all help to make Bloodborne a fluid and exhilarating experience. The world of Bloodborne is also very distinct and no less detailed than that of Dark Souls. The seamless blend of gothic and Lovecraftian horror in a beautiful Victorian era inspired setting has no shortage of detail and breathtaking scenery. To put it simply, Bloodborne is the reason why many people bought a PS4. It's almost a perfect game. In fact, the only thing stopping it from achieving perfection is, in our opinion, the Chalice Dungeon. Chalice Dungeons are a series of procedurally generated levels that the player can go through in order to obtain better blood gems, which translate to better weapons. The premise here works fine on paper, but in practice it quickly devolves into a mindless grind that's unfortunately pretty much mandatory for the endgame. And now we come to Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, the most recent FromSoftware game that launched the debate of whether gamers should be so entitled that it's a crime for a game to exist that they cannot effortlessly beat. Sekiro presents the biggest departure from the Souls formula so far in that it's an action game more than it's an RPG. Sure, some of the basic stat management is still present, but the several skill trees with unlockable abilities play a much more prominent role. In a way, Sekiro is the most difficult game made by FromSoftware. At the very least, it has the steepest learning curve. Where the previous games were difficult, they were still RPGs through and through, which meant that the bigger your stats were, the larger the margin for error was. But Sekiro is an almost all skill and no numbers. Add to that the fact that the stamina bar was replaced by a posture meter and that players can finally be punished for somersaulting across the battlefield without a care in the world and instead have to master parrying, and you've got yourself one rage-inducing game for people who refuse to get better at the game and would instead much prefer it if the enemies just rolled over and died whenever you cast them a mean glance. The focus here is entirely on breaking the enemy's posture so that you can go in for the finishing blow. The combat is so fast-paced that it even puts Bloodborne to shame. And even when you're not dealing with the finishing blow, the game revolves heavily around the different combat arts, an evolution of the weapon skill from Dark Souls 3, and shinobi tools that function a lot like Bloodborne's trick weapons. And of course, for the first time ever, the player is able to resurrect after death, which is awesome since having to run around for 2 minutes avoiding enemies on your way to try and beat that boss again was one of the most boring parts of Dark Souls. However, one of the differences between Sekiro and other FromSoftware games that we love the most has got to be the color palette. The game is set in a fictionalized version of medieval Japan that's very colorful and simply a joy to behold. Some fans of previous FromSoftware titles were disgruntled with this change as well as the change to the storytelling, which is now much more overt. We can't argue that Lordran and Yarnum don't have their unique charm, but not having to squint at your screen while playing is always an upside in our books. And that about does it for FromSoftware games, at least for now. As always, we're eagerly awaiting the next one, but at the moment, there's no telling what the next game will be, nor when it will launch. All we know for certain is that the developers are currently working on not one, but 2 unannounced projects. But that doesn't mean that there are no speculations. Many hope that one of the 2 projects is the sequel to Bloodborne and that it will either be one of the PS5 launch titles or get released soon after. There are even speculations about a Demon's Soul remaster, but given that this title is still pretty unknown to the larger populace despite the cult status of Dark Souls, we wouldn't hold our breath for it. The most exciting rumor has been one that's featured in none other than the creator of the hit series A Song of Ice and Fire, George R.R. Martin. The rumor that Martin had met with some of the FromSoftware folk first began circulating the internet a couple of months ago, but following the final episode of Game of Thrones, Martin himself has all but confirmed this in a blog post. Although he wasn't very specific, he did mention that he has consulted on a video game out of Japan. The game, allegedly called Great Rune, is very likely to be featured at this year's E3, so mark your calendars, people. Unfortunately, it looks like we won't be getting a Dark Souls 4, but perhaps that's for the best. The director doesn't want the franchise to get stretched so thin that it loses all meaning, which we can totally get behind. After all, we all know what happens when developers release the same game over and over and over again. Speaking of which, there's a link in the description to the video where we go through the chronological order of all the Assassin's Assassin's Creed games. And that about does it for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed it, and consider sharing it if you think this is something your friends ought to know about. Also, we'd like to hear which of these FromSoftware games is your favorite. Or do you think there's a Souls-like game from another developer that has done an even better job than FromSoftware? Whatever the case may be, let us know. In the meantime, may your games be fun and your losses few. And as always, we'll see you next time on Gaming Scan.